Awesome. I think we're live, John. Yeah, so how are you doing today on this fine Saturday evening where you are?
Yes, yeah, it's a very nice sunny evening here in the UK.
That's awesome. How is your week? Was it
Yeah,
hectic or?
yeah, no, it's all been good. And you?
It's been good as well. It's actually 2 o'clock where I'm at, so I'm in North Carolina. The time difference is, I still can't go over that. It's 5 hours difference, but yeah, it's awesome. Cool. I guess we can get started. So I'll introduce myself real quick and then we'll let John introduce himself. But my name is Getting. I'm one of the co-directors of engineering at Bit Project with Emily. And right now we're, I think, on week 5 of serverless camp, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, all we're trying to do is we're trying to give you, all the camp students, as much resources as we can to build your final project. And the subject of this talk today will be about JavaScript frameworks and how they can be used in web development, essentially. Right. So, John, if you want to introduce yourself. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm John Kilmister, and I'm currently a software architect, and I've been a software engineer working at a whole number of companies, generally full stack, which has included JavaScript frameworks and libraries. And hopefully in this session, I'll be able to talk over some of those and my experiences with them, and how we can utilize them to get the most out of them.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome. So I guess to start us off, do you want to give a brief overview about what is web development and like why do we even need web dev, right? Like why can't people just keep everything in their Azure functions as it is?
Yeah, so Azure Functions return JSON generally, and that is not very good for the end user. The end user wants to see a nice, pretty web page ultimately, or a native app or another experience. But the point of APIs are for computers to understand rather than humans. So yeah, we need to create this front end that can sit in front of our functions and give the user a good experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. In your experience, I know there's something out there. A lot of websites just use, I guess, vanilla HTML or JavaScript, or actually not that many anymore. But there's also a lot of websites that use some sort of framework or library, right?
Yeah, I mean, frameworks are there to solve problems. So if you don't have those problems, then vanilla JavaScript is definitely the way to go, especially today. Today, we're in a world where pretty much all the browsers now are evergreen browsers. So they'll get updated with the latest features on a regular basis. And the differences between the browsers is minimal. So we can quite confidently write vanilla JavaScript that's going to work on the majority of browsers. That wasn't the case previously, but it is today, luckily.
Yep, that's awesome. Yeah, so I know like there's at least in the web dev industry, there's a lot of times it's like a difference between like what is a framework and what is a library, right? So if you want to like talk about the differences between the two.
Yeah, there is a bit of a blurry line, but when you're writing in your plain vanilla JavaScript and you need some extra features that you don't have, you can use a library such as, say, Moment, which manages time really well. And then you can just use those functions or methods that are on the Moment library. So much like in your Azure Functions that you're writing with JavaScript, you're pulling in an npm package and using someone else's code. We can do the same with web dev on the front end and include a script that is from somebody else's code, and then use those methods and functions. So that's what a library is, and you've already been using libraries, but instead of talking about npm packages on the back end, we're now talking about JavaScript libraries on the front end, but the concept is the same. When you start to look at frameworks, we go that step further. And with a framework, we are using, again, other people's code to help us build our applications. But rather than just individual methods or particular blocks of code, we're sort of buying into a full system, and we will be picking up other bits and pieces.
You're good.
Sorry.
So yeah,
Yeah, we're picking up. We're writing our code in a particular way to work with that framework. It's a completely different system. But it makes more sense when we look at the examples.
Yeah, gotcha. So it sounds like a framework is almost like bigger and more complicated than a library is.
It can be, yes. Yeah. And you're also writing your code in a different way to work with that framework. And that framework comes with some standards and certain ways of doing things that you have to adhere to, where a library, you're just using the old method here and there. With the framework, you have to really write your code in a certain way.
Gotcha. And how do you like choose between the two, if you will, I guess, or would that depend on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, it really does come down to your use case. You want, one of the things with web development is what we try and do is make the pages load as quickly as possible.
Yes.
It's one of the factors when Google ranks it. It also, you don't want your users waiting around. It's not to say all frameworks are heavy, but the more libraries and more framework code that you bring into your application, the more the user's going to have to download, and you might see a performance impact. But it's a trade-off. We often use frameworks to speed up our development process and not have to write lots and lots of custom JavaScript for things that are pretty standard. So it's a balance between the two, and it really is a case-by-case basis. And hopefully, when we look over some of the samples, we'll see some good use cases where we would use a framework and where we necessarily wouldn't.
Interesting. Gotcha. So if you did mention that, like, the more framework code, I guess, that you use, the slower it is going to get. So what's a scenario where you would actually want to use a framework rather than just writing vanilla JavaScript, I guess?
So the framework is there for a reason. So the frameworks handle what we call single page applications really well. So it's a single web page that's in your browser. However, you can navigate around multiple pages inside that application without ever returning to the server. So that's one of the many features that a framework gives you. It also gives you reusable components. We are starting to see more of those in just vanilla JavaScript, but they kind of are better supported when they're inside a framework. So if you've got a large complex application, then that is something that you might want to go with a framework for. And data binding is the main one that I see a use case for. If you've got tables of data or lists of data, and you want to keep that table up to date with your JavaScript model in the background, again, data binding is something that frameworks are very good at.
Gotcha. Awesome. So with all this talk of frameworks, I guess what we can do is we can just dive straight into a list of around 6 frameworks and libraries that, John, you've prepared for us. Yeah,
so we don't have a lot of time to go through everyone in immense detail, and we're not going to teach you how to use any of these frameworks in this. But the point is really to give you a flavor, an idea of what the code looks like, how it's structured, and why we might use this framework over that framework. So I'll just start by sharing my screen. Just share my screen. Right. So I'm starting by sharing Visual Studio Code. This repo is available on GitHub, but don't worry, it's not too much code, and most of this is taken from the starter packs that each of the frameworks give you. So let's start by talking about plain vanilla JavaScript. So what we have here is just a HTML page, and we've got one element in there, which is an unordered list with an ID of to do. Now, all of these samples, I've done the same thing, kept it as simple as possible. So what we're doing is just getting an unordered list, and we're just putting the numbers 1 to 100 in that list. So in plain JavaScript, we can now use document.getElementById. We grab the unordered list element, and then we're going to just have a quick loop here. We're going to loop through 100 times, and then we're going to create a new list item element and set the text of it, and then add it to the page. So it's pretty simple, not a lot going on here. One of the challenges with this is that if our list changes, we'll need to clear it out and rerun it.
Exactly. Do you want to pull this page up locally, I guess? So
yeah, let's do that. So we can, because it's all in one place, we could just open this straight up in Chrome, but it's good practice to actually spin up a little mini web server to do this. So if you use npx serve on any folder that's got a HTML in it, it will quickly just spin you up a web server. The reason we need to do that is that later on, when we start breaking our JavaScript into separate files, we'll, in order to reference those correctly, it'll need to be done like that.
Gotcha.
Now it's not going to load.
Oh,
here we go.
There we go. That just took a second.
So the first time you run npx serve in a folder, it will need to pull down some files just to get that up and running. I thought I'd previously done it in this folder, but not quite.
Are there any? Sorry, I just want to jump in here real quick. Is there any difference between using npx serve or just using something like live server, or are they both really doing the same thing?
They're pretty much doing the same thing. So what npx does, it is actually the same, similar to an npm install, but it puts it in a special location that you can just run it the once and then it will get rid of it later. So it's kind of like a temporary go and execute, pull it down and execute it.
Interesting. This is taking a while to like. Is it like?
Yeah, let's move on to the Jquery one while we're at it. So we talked briefly about Jquery. Now Jquery is a library, and it was a really useful tool sort of 10 years or so ago. And the reason it was useful is that every web browser was different. They had different features. Not every bit of JavaScript code that would work on one web browser would work on the other web browser. There were also some things that might require quite a lot of JavaScript just to do a simple thing, such as an animation. And Jquery made all of that nice and simple for us. So you could just tell it to animate a fade, for example, and it would do that in one line of JavaScript. But behind the scenes, it was working out what the different browsers needed and all of that side of things. However, today, the browsers have come on a long way. We have CSS3 for animation, and there's pretty much a standard now for JavaScript across the browsers. And there are other ways when they aren't the same across the browsers, we can actually use some other techniques to solve that problem, which some of the frameworks do. So Jquery still exists, and what they've done in the newer version is they've created a real cut down version. So it no longer has all those fallbacks to old browsers, but it still has some of those helpful methods on. So it still exists. However, for most of the time, you're probably not going to need Jquery. And if we look at this sample here, we can see that the code is not too dissimilar from our plain HTML one. I'll open that in a split window. There we go. So if we look at the Jquery on the right here and the plain vanilla on the left, you can see it's slightly less code. We can append straight in there rather than kind of building the item up, but essentially it's the same.
Yeah, you're still writing that for loop, grabbing the element, and then you're still appending that child.
Yes, we've got no data binding here. We literally are just modifying the DOM or the document object model in order to do that. If we just have a look at what that looks like now, I need to share the other screen.
Yeah. You might need to drag it over.
So let me just stop sharing. So if we now look at there we go. So that's it there. Just listing, really simple. It just literally lists the numbers.
I can't see your screen. There we go. There we go. Yep.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's just listing the numbers. There's nothing special about it. But I wanted to do a simple sample that we could do in all the frameworks and just compare. So we've got no interactivity, but jQuery does give you the option to, say, do events and things like that. That said, it is very similar to plain JavaScript now. There's even a website called you may not need jQuery, I think it is. I'll just grab the link.
Yep, it's you might not need jQuery.com.
Yeah, and so a lot of companies are still using jQuery. So if you're looking for jobs, you might see jQuery, or if you arrive at a job, they might still be using it. And this website's really good. You can put in here a command that's a jQuery command, and it will then show you what the alternative is. So here, for example, we have an Ajax post, which is just a equivalent of a fetch. And then it gives you a version that would work in anything above IE, or if you want anything that would work above IE 10, you can see here the kind of equivalent. So, and yeah, you can put any method in.
Interesting.
So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's just doing that.
Yeah, so you can actually, you see here, append is pretty much the same, but instead of using the dollar syntax that jQuery is famous for, you can just do parent.append. So yeah, it's a really useful website in order to kind of wean ourselves off jQuery. And if we can remove that library from our code, our pages are going to load faster. But I did want to mention it because it is you do see it in a lot of companies still, and it was an important part of the internet.
Yeah, interesting. If you want to pull up the vanilla HTML and jQuery pages, I guess, are you able to serve them both at once? So we can look at like the differences between like when you inspect element, like you'll see in like the HTML.
Yeah, they look identical.
Oh, so everything in the jQuery it gets, even though it looks different in the actual code, it's bundled and like transformed into vanilla JavaScript, right?
It's doing the same thing pretty much. So let's go back now and have a look at some of the. Is that showing the right thing? Yeah, there we go. Right. So let's move on to. There we go. So now let's talk about handlebars. So the reason I want to talk about handlebars is it kind of falls between framework and library. So it does a bit more than a library would, but I wouldn't say it's a full-blown framework. It does one thing, and it does one thing really well, and that is data binding.
Gotcha.
So we have a look at this. The way this works, it's a bit. We'll just close that one and that one. So what we have here, we have again our HTML document, and we have this time just pulled in handlebars.js as a script at the top of the page.
Yep.
We have our element. This time I've just given it a div with an ID of app. And then this is where things start to get slightly different. So we start with a template. And this template looks a little bit different than what we've seen. What we've got here is an unordered list. And then we use the templating engine, and we can use like curly brackets to do a for loop. And then we can go back into doing HTML. And then we can pull in, again, using curly brackets, the current item in the for each loop. And then we can end our for each loop. So this is our template. And as you can see up here, it's got type handlebars template. And then as we come down to the script, this is where we're using just standard HTML to get element by ID. This time we're getting the template. Once we've got the template, we can then use the handlebars library to compile that, which gives us a template that's ready to use.
Right.
And now we can use that template and pass in our items.
Oh, so does the items there have to be the exact same thing as in the for each loop? Like
yes.
Hashtag each item.
So this here is items, that is items. If I here had a list of people, then I could have a list of people there.
Gotcha.
And you can have more properties as well. So we can put in here another property, which might be something like a welcome message like that. And then we can go like that. And now up here, we could, at the top of the page, have a H1, which then uses the welcome message.
Interesting. So you're almost injecting whatever you're passing in down there into your actual.
Yeah, and this allows us to, it's the start of binding data in a way that's really easy to update and really easy to read. If we compare that back to, say, our plain JavaScript, it's not easy to work out what's going on here. With the handlebars, you can easily see what's going on. If you've got dynamic data you want to put onto your page, particularly good for listing. So yeah, all this is doing on the item array, that's just generating the numbers 1 to 1 or 0 to 100, 0 to 99. So yeah, and then when we run this up, if we the reason that serve took a little longer last time, I was in the wrong folder. Handlebars, and now I can go npx. Hopefully this will spin straight up.
Live coding.
Yeah, it's always. If this doesn't, then we'll move on again. But
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you should be able to open this straight up directly in your HTML.
It should be able to. Browser. Yeah. So if I copy the path, and then I'll just put a new browser window. So, excuse me, I'll just change swapping screens a minute.
Very good.
So you can see we've got the hello that we put in as the message at the top, followed by our list. If we bring open the dev tools, and we inspect the elements. So dev tools will show you under elements, will show you what has been executed.
Right.
So if we look under app now, we can see we've got hello there, and then we've got our list, and inside each list item, we've got item 0, so on and so forth. If we wanted to go back and actually see the HTML that was served up, you can go to view source and see the actual one, or we can go to sources. You can click in here, and you can see that there. So Handlebars is a really good templating engine if you've just got try Handlebars. It's a web. Yeah, it's a really good. If you just want a templating engine and you don't want a full JavaScript framework, so if you've got a table of data, for example, Handlebars is a really good use case for that. If you're just displaying the table, no interactivity. We can see this website here is called Try Handlebars, and it allows you to test it out. So you can see there's your template, there's your JavaScript, and then you can run it, and it appears at the bottom. So if you just want to play with it without going too far, you can do that here. But then equally, as we saw, you can just include at the top of your web page the one
CDN.
script file. Yeah, the CDN script file, and then use that. Just in the head there, you can see that one there. So I can just pull that in.
Yep.
So that's Handlebars, and I wanted to introduce Handlebars before we kind of jump fully into a framework, because one of the big things frameworks do is data binding. Now, they go further. So Handlebars takes a template and applies it. So it's not fully binding. So say you update your data, it's not going to update your view unless you kind of manually redo it or sort of write code to do it. So this is where kind of frameworks take it up a level.
Yep. And you're talking about like Jquery and Handlebars, and they're all libraries, right? As you put them. So why do you classify them as like a library rather than a framework? If you want to go back into your previous definition of how like you don't have to like completely change the style that you're writing code.
Exactly. If we look at this Handlebars, we're still writing plain JavaScript here. You will see some of this in other frameworks, but we are keeping pretty much to the same JavaScript that we've always written. We're just using a few helper methods to help us.
Yes.
I would say Handlebars is veering more towards a framework, and some might call it a framework. But Jquery very much is a library of helper methods.
Yeah, and I guess once we get into like something like React, you can see like the difference between how right here we have to write like just one file, like a plain HTML file, and if you just write the way that almost like the way you used to, it works. But like in React, you have to adhere to like a pretty specific method of doing things. And
yeah,
right.
Yeah, and I think that's that's one of the things about React. So if we look at just a React project here, we are that's the public folder. But if we look at the source folder, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go. There's a lot more to it. You can see all of these files are all part of that React app, and we will come and look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. So before we dive into the frameworks, it's probably worth. So there are lots and lots of frameworks out there. They've all been popular at different times, and they've all been created to solve different problems, often problems that we had at a particular point in time. So when we're talking about jQuery, the reason it was created was to kind of create a layer on top of all this inconsistency. When we start looking at things like Angular or React, they were also created to solve a problem. So Angular was one of the early frameworks. It actually came out in the same year as Handlebars. And what Angular tried to do was make your application on the front end of JavaScript a lot more like your back-end application. And it made a big effort to separate out your JavaScript from your HTML, separate concerns. Gotcha. And it used the original Angular JS used something called Model View Controller as its design pattern. If you've done any other programming, you might be familiar with Model View Controller pattern. But the idea was that your code lived in these controller files, and then you bound, very much like we've just done with Handlebars, you bind your code to that, and you actually get two-way binding with it. So if you have your JavaScript object, and you update your JavaScript object, your page will update. So if you bound to a table using the templating syntax, and then you go and update that table with data that's just come back from an API, and then you update the table again, then your actual web page is going to update in real time as that kind of comes in. So, and the two-way binding allows you to fill out a form, and then rather than having to read each of the values out of those text boxes, you can just go and look at your object, your JavaScript object, and it will be pre-populated with all of the values that have just been typed into that form.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're talking about state, or when you're talking about that.
Yeah, it does have some state in it, in a way. So that's how AngularJS kind of came about. It was really a framework to manage the entirety of your application. And it had other things in there, or has other things in there, like support for the single page application, where you can navigate between pages, but you're not really navigating to pages on the web server. And it has various other capabilities. AngularJS became Angular 2 and then Angular 4 and various other versions. And as they have, as it's been updated, it's got additional features and it's changed the syntax, so the structure of it and how it's worked with. Another thing that the early frameworks did and still do to a point is make things much like jQuery. If JavaScript didn't have a feature, they wrote code that made that feature available to you. So modules are a good example. They weren't, browsers couldn't use modules. However, these frameworks, pretty much all of them support that concept. Modules people might be familiar with if you've done your backend like node work. Yeah, that wasn't previously. It hadn't been available in the browser.
So like the import statements, I guess, is what you're talking about. Yeah.
So the frameworks, sometimes through things like Webpack, provide that and make that easier for you. So,
speaking of which, like, what is Webpack? Because I've heard that word thrown around a lot, but I haven't, at least myself, like I haven't actually investigated to what it actually is.
So Webpack is it's a tool that we can use, and it will it does many things. I'm not an expert in it, but it resolves the modules for you, and it will also bundle your code together. So it will work out which bits of which libraries you're using, and it will pull that in. It will work out which parts of which JavaScript files you're using in your application and pull them in. And then it makes a JavaScript file, which can then get served with your application. It also has some useful features in there, such as something called tree shaking, which takes a large library that you might have pulled in and gets rid of all the bits you're not using. So that when we actually serve that up, it's a lot lighter.
And lighter means it'll load faster, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's lots of features that it does. I think for sort of most beginners, knowing that what it's doing, it's rearranging your JavaScript and making your application work in a way that's going to be compatible with all the browsers is a it's probably as far as you need to initially go. So that's Angular. Personally, I've only really used AngularJS, and that was a long time ago. That's why I haven't got a sample here. Much like jQuery, it is used in a lot of organizations. Companies will tend to, or large organizations, will start using a framework or pick a framework, and they'll be stuck with that framework for the next sort of 5 years or even more. Or they'll have a project that they'll start in the new framework, and they'll never go back and upgrade it. So it's not uncommon for you to join a company to find that they've got an older framework.
Gotcha.
I mean, people still are building new projects in Angular, and Angular is still going strong. It's not the most popular one at the moment, but the JavaScript community, it does, it chooses a new favorite, solve new problems quite regularly.
Gotcha. So, what is the most popular one right now, do you think?
Well, we can actually look at, so if I share my other screen again, right, so if we go back now and share this one. So there's a report called the State of JavaScript. And this is a really good resource for finding out more about kind of where the industry is going. So if we go to view the results, we can look down here and we go to libraries. Right. Libraries, here we go. Front-end frameworks. So it's not always an easy thing to answer, but we can see, for example, under usage, that React is at 80%. And Angular is at 54%, so they're still quite they're still quite the most popular, and I think partly that's because so much stuff was written in them. So it takes time for new frameworks in the usage to go up. That said, if we look at the interest and the satisfaction, we can see Svelte and Solid are up there. So on the interest side of things. We can go on and talk a little bit more about why we kind of moved from Angular to React to Vue to Svelte. As an industry. But before we do that, let's have a look at a React app and see how that's structured and how that's different than what we've been talking about with Handlebars, which is kind of a framework, and jQuery, which definitely isn't. So I'm going to swap back on my screens. So if we switch back now to here. So when we start to look at React, The good thing is if you want to get into React, it's really easy to get up and running with React. You just call there's a command, an npx command again, a bit like npx serve. This time we're calling create React app, and then you just give it the name. And what that will do is that will build you out a blank React app. It's not completely blank, sorry. It's got like a hello world sample in there that you can just go ahead and run. And this is pretty much what it gives you, but I've updated it to also do the same as our sample. Now, once you've done that, you then need to run npm install, which is something you're probably familiar with if you're with your Azure functions. And what we're doing is we're pulling down npm packages.
Sure. So it seems like we're going from like using CDN tags from like jQuery and stuff to almost like doing everything through imports now, right?
Yeah. So firstly, we're going to be doing a lot of this. We need to do a transpilation process on our machine before we can publish our website. So before we just load the HTML file and away we go. When we start working with frameworks like Angular or React, we need to convert the code from the React code into something that will work in all of the browsers. And that process is called transpilation. It's conversion. It's not compiling like you would with a C++ program, where you're actually turning it into zeros and ones effectively. What we're doing is turning it from one language into another. So we're turning it from React and the latest version of JavaScript back into an older version of JavaScript that can be run on most browsers. So before I talk about jQuery bridging that gap when JavaScript didn't have some of the features in some of the browsers, that's now covered by this transpilation process. So we can use the most up-to-date features, and transpilation will move it back to an older version that will work with all of the things. But that does have to be run on our machine.
Yeah. Awesome.
So in this folder, we have a public folder, and there's not a huge amount in this public folder. And we normally don't have to worry too much about it. Anything in this public folder just gets copied across for our application. So if you've got just a plain HTML file that you also want to include, or a logo, you can put it in this folder. But the important file is the index.html, and we won't be changing this. But much like with our Handlebars example, we had a div that had app in it, and it got injected into that page. The React app is the same. Our app will get injected into this root element here.
Gotcha.
So we're going to leave the public folder alone, and we really want to make all our changes in the source folder. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that there's quite a few different files in here. The ones that we're interested in are the app.js file, and this is where our JavaScript is going to be running for the application. Now, what React does is it merges JavaScript with HTML. And when we looked at the example of Handlebars, we can see in the Handlebars example, our template is quite clean. This isn't JavaScript as such. It's just placeholders that get replaced.
Yes.
And when we look at an Angular app, it's very similar. You have things that bind back. When it comes to React, we can actually mix things up a little bit. So we've got our JavaScript here, and we're returning a combination of HTML, but also there is some JavaScript there. So we're using a JavaScript method called map, which will return an array. And so we're going through each item in our array, and then for each item in the array using a map function, we are returning a list item with the ID, and that's then going to return a list of list items, which then get injected in. So it's a slightly different concept, but this is JSX, a combination of JavaScript and HTML all combined together. But it means that your component is all in this one place.
Right. And you also wrote it kind of like a JavaScript function, right? So I feel like that syntax might get a little bit difficult to get used to, I guess, if you're new to it.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, it is just a JavaScript function ultimately. And then this goes into our index, not into index. Yeah. So, yeah. So you can call other components in React. So this component is the top level one of app. However, I could have created another component, which was just the list item. So this could have been a function in its own right. And I could have called that. So for example, we could have a syntax, something that looks like list
items or
list
something. Yeah.
Item like that. And then, I could have something like that. And I could have created, well, we could take all of this out and make that. So we go there, simple list like that. And then we can pass in properties such as the items. So in this scenario, we're creating, we would then go away and write another function that returned that returned the HTML that we needed.
Yep.
And this can be really helpful. So I once wrote a booking app. When you go to the cinema, you can pick your individual seats.
Yes.
Yeah, it was just like that. So each of the seats were an individual component, and they looked after their own state. So they knew if they were on or off, if they were lit up or they were not lit up. And we could put that all in a single component. And then I could have a nice loop that would just generate me 100 seats. And each seat itself contained with the fact if it was on or off. So with these frameworks, we start to break stuff down into smaller components and more reusable components.
Yes, exactly.
With React, we can tell the difference between a HTML tag and our own component tag just by the fact that it's in uppercase as opposed to lowercase. So I won't go into any more detail about React, but one of the things that React was created for, when we talk about should we use it or should we use something else, was that, initially AngularJS had two-way binding. And now I believe it's optional. I haven't used it for a long time, so I don't know. But one of the things that React was there to do was to speed up the rendering process. So it did that by just having one-way binding. It also introduced something called the shadow DOM. So rather than drawing the page in the web browser straight away from your data, it would create a cached version of it and then swap it out. It is quite technical, but it gave better performance. And that was one of the things that we're driving for. React also allowed you to swap out components. So if you didn't want to use React Router, you could use a different routing engine. If you didn't want to use their state management, you could swap it out for a different one. So unlike Angular, which initially was a very large all-in-one framework, React started to introduce the concept of a modular framework where you could pick and choose which components you wanted, and you could get better performance out of it.
Exactly. And something else about React is that there's a lot of packages on npm that are already pre-made React components, right? There are a lot of CSS frameworks or just component libraries out there that are made for React or something like Next.js, which is a wrapper around React, right? So there's sometimes you don't have to actually write the CSS of this app yourself. You can actually use other people's code, and there's a giant community around React. So there's a ton of tutorials out there that are there to help you.
So you're right. And all these things, by the way, say when I compare it back to say Angular, or in a minute I'll be comparing Vue probably back to React. They don't stop still. So the Angular community will look at some of the newer features in the other frameworks and adopt those. So newer versions of those frameworks also adopt some of the features. So it's hard to give really strict comparisons, but what I'm trying to do is kind of explain why they were created and at the time of creation what the difference were.
Yep.
So yeah, React really popular, as we saw from the charts. Very modular, and is heavily used. You can also you'll also find if you do search more about React that React can also now be used for desktop applications and mobile applications, which means there's even more out there for it.
Yeah.
But there is a bit of a learning curve for it, and I'd say that's probably one of the challenges when using React. If you're not strong at your core JavaScript, then it might be a bit of a learning curve to get up to working React efficiently.
I agree. Do you have any advice for getting past that learning curve? Because I know when I learned React, it was hard for me. Just to understand how data was being passed around and like what was actually happening.
Yeah, I'd say the React website is probably the best resource. Create your React app, step through the code. You can debug this really well. And with Visual Studio Code, it's worth noting that all of the frameworks we look at today have Visual Studio extensions that give you syntax highlighting and various other tools that can help you work with your chosen framework.
Right.
I want to move on, and conscious of the time, to Vue.js, because one of the things Vue.js was trying to do was it saw Angular and React, and it wanted to be a lighter weight framework, something you could just get going on. So I've actually got two versions of the Vue.js code, and the reason that is because we can actually run Vue inside the browser without going through the full process. Now, because we're running it in the browser, we don't get the transpilation and the various other features that you might do, but it is a good way of getting started and a good way of looking at it. So if we look at this is a Vue app here. It looks very similar to when we were looking back at the handlebars. So we have an unordered list, and this time we're doing a V4 because that's part of the Vue framework, and we're going to go item in items, and we're going to loop through everything that's in our model and go through each item and render it out. And inside the script here, we create the app, and then we mount it to #app, which you can see is that div there. This data is your model. So if we've got here a model that just has one property on it, items, which is the list. But like before, we could put another, we can have our welcome message. I've got to quote it because it's things in there. So just like before, we could do that. And then in here, we could have our H1, and we could go, here we go, welcome message. Right. So as you can see, everything in here. But the difference between this and handlebars is if I go and update this array. So for example, say I had another bit of code that decided to sort that array, it would instantly update the page. Gotcha. And that can be really useful because if you've got an API call that you need to go and make to fetch data, say a search result page, you're going to be wanting to update the results. And some of those other stuff, you want to update the results again. So this type of model binding, one-way model binding is really helpful. Also, it has support for making API calls and returns. And I found Vue a lot easier when it came to state management than React. It's one of the challenges with React is the React hook things. Once you get into it, it's really powerful. But for beginners, that's I think where the steep learning curve comes from. Is learning how to deal with persisting data.
Yeah. So it's easy to get started, but like it's harder to like actually do it well and correctly. Yes.
With React, you mean?
Yes, with React.
Yeah, I like Vue's approach in this case. So yeah, that's the simplest Vue app, and all we're doing here is pulling in the script. If we look at this example, we've gone a little bit further, and we've actually put the component in a separate JavaScript file. So in this case, we've still got our data object, but we've got our template here, a lot more like we had with the handlebars example.
Yeah.
And if we go back to the HTML, we can then see we're importing that.
Yeah.
And then we're using a script type module. So this comes a little bit down to what I was saying about newer browsers supporting modules now. So we can use the import syntax, and then we can just create our app and mount it. So that's another way where we start splitting it out a bit more. But I would definitely recommend, if you are thinking of using Vue, making a full Vue app. And much like we did the Create React app, we can create a Vue app here. So again, this time we can do an npm init on a Vue latest and an npm install. And then to run it, we need to do an npm run dev. Oh, that's worth noting on React as well, because you've got that transpilation process to go through. If you want to run your app, you have to go npm run dev. Or on React app, I think it's slightly different. It's npm run start. But essentially, you need to run some code that'll transpile it, that'll do some various other bits and pieces and get you up and running. So in our Vue app here, when we've got a more fully featured Vue app, you can see there are a lot more files, and it looks a lot more like a React app. However, our Vue component is still really simple. So we pull in here our component. So app Vue is the entry point, much like our React app had an app component. But this time, I've pulled the list out into a separate component, and you can see here, much like React, we're just calling our component with its name here, as if it was a tag. Now, Vue is quite good in the fact that it supports both JSX, so it supports the React way of working, where you mix JavaScript and HTML, and it also supports another syntax where you keep everything quite separate.
Interesting.
So if we go to Vue here, we can see that we've got our data at the top, just like before, and then we've got our template separate here. So unlike React, in this particular example, we're not creating a function to return everything. So each framework has its own way and its own style. And I'd say that's probably the biggest thing with any of these is that if you've decided you've got a need, if you've got complex data binding or just data binding that you want to do, or you're pulling in, you're pulling stuff from an API and then you're updating the screen and then you're pulling more stuff from an API and you've got a lot of interactivity going on, or you need a multi-page app and you decided you need a framework. Yeah, the ramp up to do it using a framework is a little bit, but once you get going, it can really help.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think Vue's approach, from what I've seen, my personal experience, is that it's quicker and easier to get up and running, and it doesn't have some of the complexities that React has. Yet you can use a lot of the same syntax.
Interesting.
And again, you just if you look at the Vue website, they've got some really good documentation on getting started. So that's kind of the frameworks I wanted to kind of quickly go over. I don't have time to cover Svelte today. I've not used it, but I have read more about it. What they were trying to do there is do a lot more of the work at build time. So we talked about transpilation.
Yes.
My understanding is with Svelte, they go even further. So they work out, they don't use the shadow DOM in the same way that React and Vue use it. To get the performance out of it, they do the work at build time to organize and optimize your JavaScript. I've only just started looking at it myself. As a full stack dev, I don't spend all my time in JavaScript. So if you're interested, there are loads of good videos on it. It is a newer framework, so finding support for newer frameworks online, there's less questions if less people are using it. But it's an option, and it might be something people are interested in. In
the little bit of time that we do have left, I think in this thing, we had a way of people for submitting like questions they wanted to ask you, and I think there's 3 questions on here. So let's go with you. I will go ahead and fire those away at you.
Go on then.
Awesome. So first question that we did have is using Next.js overkill for a small personal project? I assume small personal project could mean like either a web app they want to build or maybe like a personal website.
I think with all of these things, so let's just quickly cover what Next.js is. And also let's talk a little bit about Gatsby as well. So in the pursuit of making faster and faster websites, one of the challenges with frameworks is that when your page initially loads, it loads that blank HTML page that we see. So there is a delay between that blank page appearing and loading in all of the JavaScript and then running your components. So in order to overcome that, what we can do is we can actually do the initial render at the build time. And this is what we call a static website.
Yes.
So if you've got a, say this list here that we're generating, we could, when we do our build process, we could generate the page as it would look the first time. So actually, in our case, that would already have the 100 items already rendered. So when we actually go and look at it in a browser and look at the HTML that's sent from the server, it will have the 100 items in there. But we still get the full support of the framework, because if we want to update that list, it will be bound to that list and get updated accordingly.
Yeah.
So that's a static website, and they normally sit on top of frameworks. So Gatsby is a good example. It's an opinionated version of React. So they've chosen a React router, they've chosen various other things, and they've chosen a file structure as well. And it is a good way of getting started with React in some ways, because everything's kind of laid out for you and it's quite easy to see where to put your code.
Right.
Next.js started off allowing you to run a Node backend with a React front end. However, Next.js also allows you to now build static websites that can be hosted in Azure. Going back to the question, is it overkill for a small personal project?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. It does just depend on what you're doing. It's a bit like, is a framework overkill for your project? It really does depend on your use case. I would say if you've got a lot of interactivity and you're updating the page multiple times, then yes, a framework is the right way to go. And framework on its own, or a framework with static site generation, like Next or Gatsby, then yeah, I don't think it's overkill to choose a static site generator over just a plain framework. Yeah. So both Next.js and Gatsby are built on top of React. There is a version built on top of Vue. I can't remember what it's called. And then there's also a static site generator called Hugo, which is just HTML based.
Awesome. Gotcha. Next question that we had was, which framework do you recommend for beginners that just started learning about web development?
It's a really good question. I would, at this point in time, I'd probably choose Vue. But I think Vue's got the, out of the ones, I don't know anything much about Svelte, and but yeah, I would say from my recent experience with Vue, I would choose Vue. I've probably done my most work in React. I spent 6 or 7 years writing React code. But yeah, I would say to get up and running, Vue is would be my choice, but there's a learning curve to all of them.
Yeah, and there's a lot to choose from, right? So there's not like one right answer or so, because you can always switch, right? The main concepts in something like Vue and React are still persistent almost, right? There's this concept of components.
There is. I wouldn't switch halfway through doing a project necessarily.
Yeah.
You would have to rewrite a lot of your code. But yeah, if you start learning it and go, actually, I prefer, maybe, just try a little starter project with 2 different frameworks and see how you get on with it. And yeah, kind of go from there. But yeah, it does depend, as say, on your experience previously. React has a really good market for it at the moment. As I said, a lot of companies do look for React. So you could always think of it from that point. Not as many adverts I see for Vue. So it does depend.
Yep, definitely. Last question we had was, could you please explain again about the transpilation process that goes from something like React code to the actual vanilla or HTML, CSS, JS that you see?
Yeah. So when you, actually, what I might do is I might run up the React app and then we can have a quick look at it.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
I will just load that up and then I will share that. So I'm just running it up at the moment. So npm go into the React folder, and then npm run start. So that's just kicking off now. Once that's gone up, I'll talk about it while it's loading up. Oh, that's brilliant. It's not going to work. No such file. Am I in the wrong folder?
No. I think React is capital there.
Oh, it's in the demo folder.
Oh, yeah, you have to go into demo as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on a Windows machine, so most things aren't case sensitive, but it can catch you out. It is best to keep to the same casing.
There you go. Now it's going.
Yeah. So yeah, while that's kicking off, we can talk about the process. So it's a multi-stage process. The things that we're doing are we are taking the JavaScript files as that we have here, and we're converting them. Well, they all get merged together, and then we're also looking. It looks to convert them down to JavaScript that can run on your target set of browsers. In the React app, I believe you can set that inside the configuration. Somewhere here, there is a setting in one of, it might be in the, yeah, here we go, browser list. So this is a browser list, so it will try and support any browser that's more than 0.2%. It's not dead, and it's not Opera Mini. So and you can see here for development purposes, yeah, it's looking at these. So yeah, it's going through and it's converting the JavaScript we're using down to a version that can be used in the browsers, but it's also the browser isn't going to understand. Looking at the Vue one now, but yeah, if we're in here, it doesn't understand these curly brackets and inside the middle of HTML, so it does away with all of that. You can write React not with JSX, so you're closer to what it's actually doing, and it looks a lot more like our plain JavaScript version when it creates a component and then it adds that component to the page and various other bits and pieces. So the Transpilation is doing that for us. It's taking this JSX and it's turning it into effectively plain JavaScript that can be run, but it's doing lots and lots of other clever stuff. Yeah, and that's using Babel and Webpack. Babel does a transpilation, and then Webpack like combines it and other bits and pieces. Now, I'm sorry, carry on.
You're good. So essentially, it's like turning everything in your React app into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's what the browser actually understands, right? It doesn't. The browser doesn't understand what JSX is.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So if I now just switch over to the browser, share my other screen, we can have a quick look at. Oh, find the right window now. Sorry about that. Share screen. So it's still just loading. My computer's whirring away today. So now, one of the things that these frameworks give you, which is really nice, is hot reload. So we've done the we've started our development server here, and it's done the Transpilation process. And it'd be really annoying if we had to stop and start all the time. So now this is also connected and done a hot reload, so we can any changes that we make will be visible in the browser instantly.
So let's say you change, like, it's loading right now, so it's kind of hard to demonstrate, but like if there was like the text hello world on this screen right here in the app.js file, if you had that, you just change it to hello Bob instead, or hello John. You don't actually have to stop the entire server, do npm run dev again. As long as you just save that file, it's going to update on this.
Exactly, yes. The curse of the live demo. I do apologize. I think my machine is finally had enough today.
You're good. But yeah, I think what you want to describe what you would see if you looked at the dev tools in here.
Yeah, so when you look at the dev tools, you'll start to see, it's probably not gonna, yeah, so at the moment it's got a blank page, but under sources, you'll see here a combination of the raw, if we've got it, the source map files. So when you do the transpilation, it creates a whole set of other files which are mappings back to the original application. So there's an error somewhere in there. Okay, but we can see under sources, we'll be able to hopefully still see, we see bundle.js, and this is our JavaScript. And as we can see things in here that are similar to what we wrote. So you can see there's our function app, and there's my line that gets me 100 items. That is exactly the same. It didn't need to do anything to get that working. But now, if we have a look at the next bit, we can see that it's taken all of the rest of the JSX, which is where we were mixing the HTML and JavaScript, and it's gone and written all of this code. Now, this is also calling functions that exist that they've pulled in and various other bits and pieces. But as you can see, it's not the code that we wrote. So that's the CSS. I don't know if the... Yeah. So, yeah, that's not it. So it hasn't been... I haven't fully set this up, but you can get source maps. And if you've got source maps installed, which get generated at the build time, you can then still see in the source the original, and it can be executing the bundle. Oh, there actually, no, we have got here we go. So here we go. So we can actually see our JSX, and we can put breakpoints in here. However, that's not what it's running. It's running the bundle. However, the source maps are helping us and linking the two together, or should I say helping Chrome link the two together so we can still step through it. But the transpilation process is effectively taking your code, turning it into this, something that will run on all the browsers.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Those were the three that I saw in here.
Yeah, before we finish, I'd like to just quickly jump into the Azure Portal, just talk about static apps just briefly.
Yeah, go for it.
So one of the challenges with the frameworks is that we've got our app running here, but it's running up a local web server. And before it's done that, it's done all the npm start. So it's done the the transpilation and the building process.
Exactly.
Now, if we have just a HTML page, we can just put that onto a web server and run it, just like we can run it from our machine, and everything runs perfectly fine. But there has to be a process. If we're going to be running this on a static, if we're going to be running this on a server, then we need to be able to do that process beforehand. So with static web apps, I think this was demonstrated with the previous session that you had with Anthony. So let me just let's just quickly log in.
Yep, take your time. So do you want to actually deploy into our website, or do you want to just talk about it?
I'll just talk about it because I don't think we've got a huge amount of time left, and I don't want to take up too much time. But when we have, so Azure Static Web Apps, if you haven't seen them before, this is a service offered by Azure for hosting both framework apps that we've just seen, so like Vue, React, but also those static web apps, things like Next.js, Hugo, or Gatsby. But what it will do for you, if we just create an app here, click create. So you just search static web apps, we create them. And now, we give it a name. As you can see, we've got two different plans. We've got free and we've got standard. For pretty much everything that is doing here, free will be plenty. If you're doing this for commercial purposes, then you'd consider standard, but it's still reasonable. But what we can do is we can actually hook it into GitHub. So say we've created our app and we've pushed it up to GitHub. Once we've signed in with GitHub, it will actually create as a GitHub action. And that GitHub action will then do that npm build for us. So if I go across to GitHub, and I'll just show you one that I had done earlier.
So is it something like as long as you push the repo, it's going to go ahead and deploy it and make your changes live on the website every time?
Exactly, and it does more than that. So if we just have a look, so these are the workflows that it automatically creates for you. So we don't need to worry about this code, but what we can see it's doing here is that it's on a push, then it will go and do a build and deploy of that application. And when you actually go through here, if I just sign in with GitHub pretty quickly, and just signing in on the other window. Sorry, I need to. It's always the way it asks for your password and two-factor auth when you're doing a demo, don't you? So wait, when I get that. So it's doing the auth in another window, so you can't see that. Just going back. Okay, so now we've signed in. We now can select our organization, and then we select our repo. So if we take this website that I've got there, and then we select which branch. Typically, you'll want your main branch. Now here we pick up presets, and this is where we say, okay, we've got Blazor or Blazor or Next. So it knows then how to build that app. So depending which framework you pick, depends on which one you pick here. And there's our static site generators: Gatsby, Hugo, ViewPress. Next.js is supported here under framework. So yeah, I haven't actually deployed a Next.js app with a static web app, but it should be should be relatively straightforward. So once you've done that, then every time you push to your main branch, it will run that GitHub action automatically and deploy it to your website, to your free website. And if you create a feature branch, so create a branch in GitHub and push to that, as soon as you create a pull request, it will create you a staging site. So you can go and have a look at it, check it out, make sure you're happy with it before you merge that back in, and then it will deploy it out to production.
Oh, that's nice.
It's something I use for my blog. So I'll have a particular post, put that on a feature branch, and then I can review it and read it. And it gives you a special URL for that nobody else has access to. And then once you're happy with it, then you can merge in. So I really like static web apps. As I said, for personal projects, they're free and they integrate really easily. If you didn't do it this way, you would have to write your own GitHub action in order to do that build process, which for each of the different frameworks, they're all subtly different.
Yeah, and here it's just, you just choose one and you're done.
Yeah, and it creates it all for you. So that's why I wanted to spend the last few minutes just quickly showing you this, because I think, being able to deploy your app live is the final stage of the process and well worth doing.
Definitely. Awesome.
So yeah. Are there any other questions before we finish?
Let me check one more time. I don't think there's any other questions. That's should be it for today. Thanks for taking the time to come on this stream with us today, John.
That's all right. Hopefully you found it useful.
Yeah, it was very insightful. Yeah, in that case, for everyone watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this was helpful for you, whether you're creating your final project for serverless camp or if you're just trying to learn more about frameworks in general. We hope this was useful. Yeah, thanks for coming. Awesome.